The metal gates slammed shut behind Jessica as she stormed out of the HOA meeting, her face flushed with rage. She had just been slapped with a hefty fine for installing an unapproved hammock in her backyard. A hammock that the HOA president's own husband had convinced her to buy. Now, Jessica was determined to uncover the truth and expose the corruption festering at the heart of her homeowners association. Jessica paced the living room, her hands trembling as she replayed the confrontation in her mind. How dare they single her out and punish her for something the HOA president's husband had recommended? It was a blatant act of favoritism, and she refused to let it stand. Her husband, Mark, watched her with concern. "Jess, I know you're upset, but we need to be careful here. These people had a lot of power, and they don't take kindly to being challenged." "I don't care, Mark," Jessica snapped. "They can't just make up rules as they go and selectively enforce them. This is our home, and I'm not going to let them bully us around." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, so what's the plan? How are you going to handle this?" Jessica's eyes narrowed with determination. "I'm going to start digging. There has to be more to this story than what they're telling us, and I'm not going to stop until I uncover the truth." The next morning, Jessica set out, determined to get to the bottom of the HOA's actions. She started by combing through the association's records, searching for any mention of the hammock policy or previous violations. But the more she dug, the more she realized that the trail was carefully covered up. Frustrated, she decided to pay a visit to the HOA president, Susan. As she approached the imposing gates of Susan's sprawling estate, Jessica felt a surge of anger. How could the president live in such luxury while the rest of the community was held to such stringent standards? "Jessica, what a surprise," Susan said, feigning innocence as she opened the door. "What can I do for you?" "You know damn well why I'm here, Susan," Jessica said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "I want to know why I was singled out for a violation when your own husband was the one who recommended the hammock to me." Susan's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Jessica saw a flash of panic in her expression. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Don't give me that," Jessica snapped. "I have the receipts, Susan. Your husband told me the hammock would be a great addition to my backyard, and now I'm being fined for it. I want to know what's really going on here." Susan's facade crumbled, and she sighed heavily. "All right, fine. You caught us. My husband and I have been using our positions on the HOA board to line our own pockets. We've been approving violations and then having our friends and family members fix them for a hefty fee." Jessica's jaw dropped, and she felt a surge of righteous anger. "So you're telling me that you've been exploiting your neighbors for your own personal gain?" "Look, Jessica, it's just business," Susan said, her eyes narrowing. "If you keep your mouth shut, maybe we can work something out. I'm sure we can find a way to make this all go away." Jessica's resolve hardened. "No way, Susan. I'm not going to be part of your corrupt little scheme. I'm going to expose the truth, and I'm going to make sure you and your husband pay for what you've done." With that, Jessica turned on her heel and stormed off, determined to bring the HOA's dirty secrets to light. Jessica's heart raced as she left Susan's house, her mind whirling with the implications of what she had just uncovered. The HOA president and her husband were running a blatant scheme, exploiting their neighbors for personal gain. She knew she couldn't let this stand, but the thought of taking on the powerful couple filled her with a sense of dread. As she walked down the pristine, manicured streets of the neighborhood, Jessica couldn't help but notice the carefully curated facades of the homes around her. Each one was a carefully constructed image, hiding the corruption and greed that lurked beneath the surface. She knew she needed to act quickly before Susan and her husband had a chance to cover their tracks. Arriving home, Jessica burst through the door, her eyes wild with determination. "Mark, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The HOA president and her husband have been running a scam, finding people for fake violations and then forcing them to pay their friends to fix the problem. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. You're kidding me. Are you sure about this? Positive, Jessica said, her hands clenched into fists. They tried to bribe me to keep quiet, but there's no way I'm going to let them get away with this. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed with worry. This is big, Jess. If you take them on, they're not going to go down without a fight. These people have a lot of power and influence in the community. Jessica nodded, her resolve unwavering. I know, but I can't just sit back and let them continue to exploit our neighbors. This is our home, Mark, and I'm not going to let them turn it into their own personal pity bank. She paced the room, her mind racing with possibilities. I need to start gathering evidence, build a case that's ironclad. I'm going to need help, though. I can't take them on alone. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and admiration. All right, Jess, I'm with you. Whatever you need, I'll be right here by your side. Jessica smiled, feeling a surge of determination. Okay, then let's get to work. We're going to bring these crooks down, once and for all. Over the next few days, Jessica immersed herself in a frenzy of research and investigation. She combed through every scrap of HOA documentation she could get her hands on, piecing together a damning trail of evidence that pointed directly to Susan and her husband's corrupt activities. As she delved deeper, she began to uncover a network of connections between the HOA board members and local contractors, all of whom seemed to be profiting from the scheme. It was a tangled web of deceit and greed, and Jessica knew she had to be careful not to get caught in it herself. Finally, after weeks of tireless work, Jessica felt confident that she had enough information to expose the truth. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, determined to confront them with her findings and demand justice for the community. As the members of the board filed into the room, Jessica could feel the tension in the air. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady and unwavering. I'm here today to expose a shocking truth about the leadership of our homeowners association. The room fell silent as Jessica's words hung in the air, the weight of her statement palpable. She could feel the eyes of the HOA board members fixed on her, a mix of curiosity and unease etched on their faces. What exactly are you implying, Jessica? Susan, the HOA president, asked, her voice dripping with false concern. Jessica took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. I'm implying that you and your husband have been running a corrupt scheme within this association, exploiting your neighbors for personal gain. A murmur rippled through the room, and Jessica saw a flash of panic in Susan's eyes. That's a very serious accusation, the president said, her voice trembling slightly. Do you have any proof to back up such a claim? As a matter of fact, I do, Jessica replied, her voice unwavering. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of documents, carefully organized and labeled. I've spent the last few weeks combing through the HOA's records, and what I've uncovered is nothing short of appalling. She began laying out the evidence, one piece at a time. There were copies of invoices showing exorbitant fees charged to homeowners for minor violations. Alongside them were receipts for work done by contractors with close ties to the HOA board members. You see, this isn't about upholding community standards, Jessica continued, her eyes narrowing. This is about you and your friends lining your pockets at the expense of your neighbors. Susan's face had turned ghostly pale, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The other board members began to murmur and whisper, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. This is outrageous, one of the members exclaimed. If what Jessica is saying is true, then the entire HOA leadership is corrupt. Exactly, Jessica said, her voice rising with conviction. And I have evidence that this corruption extends far beyond the Hammock incident. This is just the tip of the iceberg. She proceeded to lay out a damning case, detailing the web of connections between the HOA board, local contractors, and a pattern of suspicious fines and repair work. The room erupted in a cacophony of outrage and disbelief as the truth began to sink in. Susan, her composure crumbling, tried to defend herself. "This is all circumstantial," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't prove any wrongdoing on our part." "Oh, but I can," Jessica said, her eyes narrowing. "And I intend to take this evidence to the authorities. You and your husband are going to pay for what you've done to this community." The room exploded into a frenzy as the other board members turned on Susan, demanding answers and calling for her resignation. Jessica watched, a grim satisfaction settling in her stomach. She had finally found the leverage she needed to bring down the corrupt HOA leadership. As the meeting descended into chaos, Jessica caught Mark's eye. He gave her a proud nod, and she knew in that moment that she had made the right choice. This was only the beginning of a long and arduous battle, but Jessica was determined to see it through to the end. The aftermath of Jessica's explosive revelation at the HOA meeting was nothing short of chaos. The once orderly gathering had descended into a cacophony of outraged voices as the other board members turned on Susan, demanding answers and calling for her resignation. Jessica watched the proceedings with a mix of satisfaction and trepidation. She had finally exposed the truth, but she knew that the battle was far from over. The corrupt leadership of the HOA would not go down without a fight, and she braced herself for the fallout. As the meeting descended into a shouting match, Susan rose from her seat, her face flushed with rage. "This is outrageous," she spat, her eyes narrowing at Jessica. "You have no right to come in here and make these baseless accusations." Jessica stood her ground, her expression unwavering. "Baseless? I have the evidence to prove every single one of my claims. You and your husband have been exploiting this community for your own personal gain, and I won't rest until you're held accountable." Susan's lips curled into a sneer. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Jessica. This HOA is my kingdom, and I won't let some upstart like you come in and tear it down." "Your kingdom?" Jessica scoffed. "This isn't your personal fiefdom, Susan. It's our community, and we deserve better than the kind of corruption you've been perpetuating." The other board members, sensing the shifting tide, began to murmur in agreement. Jessica could see the fear and uncertainty in Susan's eyes, and she knew that she had struck a nerve. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Susan spat. "Well, let me tell you something. This isn't over. I have friends in high places, and I'm not going down without a fight." With that, she stormed out of the meeting, the other board members trailing behind her, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and trepidation. As the room emptied, Jessica felt a wave of both triumph and trepidation. She had taken the first step in bringing down the corrupt HOA leadership, but she knew that the real battle was just beginning. Turning to Mark, she let out a heavy sigh. "Well, that went about as well as I expected. Susan is not going to take this lying down." Mark nodded, his brow furrowed with concern. "I know. She's got a lot of power and influence in this community, and she's not going to go down without a fight. We need to be prepared for whatever she throws at us." Jessica squared her shoulders, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Then we'll be ready. I'm not going to let her and her cronies continue to exploit our neighbors. This ends now." She began to gather up the evidence, carefully organizing it and making copies. "I'm going to take this to the local news, see if we can get some media attention on this. Maybe that will put some pressure on Susan and the rest of the board." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression filled with pride. "I'm with you, Jess. Whatever happens, I've got your back." Jessica smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude and determination. "Thanks, babe. Let's do this." With that, the two of them set out, determined to bring the corrupt HOA leadership to its knees and restore justice to their community. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, Jessica and Mark worked tirelessly to build their case against the corrupt leadership. They had uncovered a web of deceit and greed that ran deep within the association, and they were determined to bring it all to light. Armed with the damning evidence they had gathered, they reached out to the local news outlets, hoping to generate some much-needed public attention. Their efforts paid off when a local investigative reporter, intrigued by the story, agreed to look into the matter. The reporter, a tenacious and relentless individual, dug even deeper, interviewing other homeowners and uncovering even more disturbing details about the HOA's shady practices. Soon, the story began to gain traction, and the community started to take notice. As the media coverage intensified, Susan and the rest of the HOA board members found themselves on the defensive. They attempted to discredit Jessica and Mark, painting them as disgruntled troublemakers. But the overwhelming evidence proved too much to ignore. "This is a clear case of abuse of power and corruption," the reporter declared during a live segment, her expression grave. "The homeowners of this community have been taken advantage of for far too long, and it's time for the truth to come to light." The public outrage was palpable, and it wasn't long before the local authorities took notice. Investigators were dispatched to the community, and they began to pore over the HOA's financial records and other documents. Jessica and Mark watched the unfolding events with a mix of relief and trepidation. They knew that the battle was far from over, and that Susan and her cohorts would stop at nothing to protect their illicit empire. "This is just the beginning," Jessica said, her eyes narrow with determination. "We've got them on the ropes, but they're not going to give up without a fight." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "I know, but we can't back down now. We've come too far to let them off the hook. We need to keep the pressure on and make sure they're held accountable for their actions." Together, they continued to cooperate with the authorities, providing them with every piece of evidence they had uncovered. They also reached out to other homeowners, encouraging them to come forward with their own stories of HOA misconduct. As the investigation deepened, the walls began to close in on Susan and her cronies. One by one, the board members started to crack, turning on each other and offering up incriminating information in exchange for leniency. Jessica watched the unfolding drama with a sense of satisfaction, but also a growing sense of unease. She knew that the battle was far from over, and that there would be consequences for taking on the powerful forces within the HOA. But she refused to back down. This was her home, her community, and she wasn't going to let a group of corrupt officials continue to exploit it for their own personal gain. Whatever the cost, she was determined to see this through to the end. As the investigation into the HOA's corrupt practices intensified, the pressure on Susan and her cohorts continued to mount. With each passing day, more damning evidence came to light, and the community's outrage only grew stronger. Jessica and Mark watched the unfolding events with a mix of relief and trepidation. They knew that their fight was far from over, and that Susan and her allies would stop at nothing to protect their illicit empire. One day, as Jessica was tending to her garden, she received an unexpected visitor, Susan herself, her face twisted with a mixture of rage and desperation. "What do you think you're doing, Jessica?" the HOA president hissed, her eyes narrowed to slits. "You're destroying everything I've worked for." Jessica straightened up, her expression unwavering. "I'm doing what's right for this community, Susan. You and your cronies have been exploiting us for far too long, and it's time for it to stop." Susan's lips curled into a snarl. "You have no idea what you're up against. I have friends in high places, and they're not going to let you take me down without a fight." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. "I don't care who your friends are, Susan. The truth is on my side, and I'm not going to stop until you and your husband are held accountable for your actions." Susan's face flushed with rage, and she stepped closer, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Before Jessica could react, Susan reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "Here's a little something for you and your husband," she said, her lips curling into a cruel smile. Consider it a warning. Jessica's heart raced as she took the envelope, her hands trembling. She opened it, and her blood ran cold at the sight of the contents. A stack of photos, each one depicting her and Mark in compromising situations. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fear. "Just a friendly reminder that I have eyes and ears everywhere," Susan purred. "If you don't back off, I'll make sure your little life gets turned upside down. And trust me, you don't want to find out what I'm capable of." With that, Susan turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Jessica rooted to the spot, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. Clutching the envelope, Jessica hurried inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to show these photos to Mark, to warn him of the threat they were facing. As she burst through the door, Mark looked up, his expression quickly shifting from surprise to concern. "Jess, what's wrong?" Jessica thrust the envelope into his hands, her voice trembling. "Susan paid me a visit. She left us these photos. She's threatening us, Mark. We need to be careful." Mark's face darkened as he examined the contents of the envelope, his jaw clenching with anger. "This is blackmail, pure and simple. She's trying to scare us into backing off." Jessica nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "I know. But what if she follows through? What if she really does try to ruin our lives?" Mark pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're not going to let her, Jess. We've come too far to back down now. We're going to keep fighting, no matter what she throws at us." Jessica took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "You're right. We can't let her intimidate us. We have to keep going, for the sake of this community." With renewed determination, they set to work, preparing for the next phase of their battle against the corrupt HOA leadership. They knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, but they were more determined than ever to see justice prevail. The threat from Susan and the HOA board weighed heavily on Jessica and Mark's minds, but they refused to be intimidated. They knew that they had come too far to back down now, and they were determined to see their fight against the corrupt leadership through to the end. With the incriminating photos in hand, they doubled down on their efforts to gather more evidence and build their case. They reached out to other homeowners, encouraging them to come forward with their own stories of HOA misconduct, and the responses they received were overwhelming. Homeowner after homeowner came forward, sharing tales of unjust fines, unfair enforcement of rules, and blatant favoritism towards the board members and their associates. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the corruption within the HOA ran deeper than they had ever imagined. As the investigation continued, the local authorities tightened the noose around Susan and her cohorts. Charges were filed, and the pressure mounted as the community rallied behind Jessica and Mark's crusade for justice. But Susan and her allies were not going down without a fight. They launched a smear campaign, painting Jessica and Mark as disgruntled troublemakers who were out to destroy the community they all loved. They even went so far as to accuse the couple of orchestrating the entire scandal for their own personal gain. However, the overwhelming evidence against the HOA leadership proved too much to ignore, and the public overwhelmingly supported Jessica and Mark's efforts. The media coverage only intensified, shining a spotlight on the corruption and garnering even more attention from the authorities. One day, as Jessica and Mark were preparing for another meeting with the investigators, they received a startling phone call. It was the local district attorney informing them that Susan and several other board members had been arrested and charged with a litany of crimes, including fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. "This is a major victory for your community," the district attorney said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and satisfaction. "We couldn't have done it without your tireless efforts to uncover the truth." Jessica and Mark stared at each other, their eyes wide with disbelief and joy. After months of relentless work, they had finally succeeded in bringing down the corrupt HOA leadership. The sense of triumph was palpable, but they also knew that the road ahead would not be an easy one. "This is just the beginning," Jessica said, her voice filled with determination. We need to work with the authorities to ensure that the entire HOA board is held accountable, and that the community is made whole again. Mark nodded, his expression resolute. I'm with you, Jess. We're not going to stop until we've rooted out every last bit of corruption in this place. Together, they set out to continue their fight, determined to rebuild the HOA and restore trust and integrity to their community. The battle had been long and arduous, but in the end, they had emerged victorious, proving that even the mightiest of corrupt institutions could be brought down by the unwavering determination of a few brave souls. In the aftermath of the arrests and charges against the corrupt HOA leadership, Jessica and Mark found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The community, once divided and disillusioned, had rallied around them, expressing their gratitude and support for their tireless efforts. As the investigation continued, more and more details about the HOA's shadowy operations came to light. The scale of the corruption was staggering, with the board members and their associates having siphoned off millions of dollars in misappropriated funds and illegal kickbacks. Jessica and Mark were hailed as heroes, their names splashed across local headlines as the community celebrated the downfall of the once powerful HOA. But the couple knew that the real work was just beginning. We can't just sit back and let the authorities handle this, Jessica said, her eyes filled with determination. We need to be actively involved in the process of rebuilding the HOA and restoring trust in our community. Mark nodded in agreement. You're right. This is our home, and we have a responsibility to make sure it's run the way it's supposed to be. We can't let the corruption creep back in. Together, they worked closely with the district attorney's office, providing crucial testimony and evidence to support the ongoing investigation. They also reached out to their fellow homeowners, organizing town hall meetings and community events to facilitate open dialogue and gather input on the future of the HOA. The process was arduous and at times overwhelming, but Jessica and Mark refused to be deterred. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were more determined than ever to see this through. As the legal proceedings progressed, the former HOA board members were systematically stripped of their power and influence. One by one, they were convicted and sentenced, their ill-gotten gains seized and returned to the community. With the corrupt leadership removed, the residents of the community finally had a chance to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But Jessica and Mark knew that the real work was just beginning. They spearheaded the creation of a new HOA board, one that was comprised of a diverse group of homeowners, all committed to transparency, accountability, and serving the best interests of the community. Together, they worked tirelessly to establish new policies, procedures, and oversight mechanisms to prevent any future corruption from taking root. It was a long and arduous process, but every step of the way, Jessica and Mark were there, guiding the community towards a brighter future. And as they watched the once crumbling HOA transform into a model of good governance, they knew that their fight had been worth it. In the end, the hammock that had started it all became a symbol of the community's resilience and the power of standing up against corruption. It served as a constant reminder that even the mightiest of institutions can be brought down by the unwavering determination of a few brave souls. As Jessica and Mark sat on their newly installed hammock, gazing out over the meticulously maintained neighborhood, they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. They had faced down the forces of corruption and emerged victorious, and they knew that their story would inspire others to do the same. The journey had been long and arduous, but in the end, they had found their own form of justice, and they knew that their community would be all the better for it.